The doors of Harlow Memorial Hospital burst open at 2:47 in the morning, and the man they dragged in was already dying. Eyes rolled back, jaw locked, body rigid as rebar. Blood had dried black across his collar. The trauma team rushed in, loud and certain, snapping orders at each other while the monitors screamed. And then a quiet blonde nurse standing at the edge of the room said 4 words that stopped every single doctor cold. "Don't touch him yet." Dr. Marcus Fenn turned around slowly, the way a man turns when something beneath him has just spoken out of turn. "Excuse me?" Nora Callaway didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "If anyone touches that patient without a barrier protocol in place," she said, "this room becomes a kill zone." Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the story you're about to hear is exactly the kind that keeps you up until 3 a.m. wondering how you missed it. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. And if it hooks you the way I think it will, tap that like button so the next person finds it too. Now, let's go back to Harlow Memorial, and to the nurse nobody saw coming. The night shift at Harlow Memorial Hospital in Denton, Washington, had a rhythm to it that most of the staff had long stopped noticing. Gurneys squeaking down linoleum floors, the low mechanical hum of the ventilation system, the occasional burst of radio chatter from the ambulance bay. For the people who worked it, the ones who'd been doing it long enough that the fluorescent lights no longer gave them headaches, it was background noise. Familiar, almost comfortable. Nora Callaway had been working nights for 4 years. She knew the rhythm better than anyone, and she'd learned early on that the best way to survive it was to stay invisible. Not because she was weak, not because she didn't have opinions, because she'd learned, slowly and at some cost, that visibility in this particular department came with a tax she wasn't willing to pay every single night. She was 33 years old, unremarkable in the way she dressed, precise in the way she moved. Her blonde hair was always pulled back tight, not styled, just managed. She wore the same brand of white sneakers every shift, because they were the only pair that didn't make her feet ache by hour 6. She didn't socialize in the break room, didn't linger after handoff, didn't participate in the informal social economy of the night team, the gossip, the petty alliances, the running commentary on which attending was sleeping with which resident. She did her job, she did it well, and she went home. That was the deal she'd made with herself, and for 4 years it had held. Dr. Marcus Fenn was the reason the deal existed in the first place. He was 46, broad through the shoulders, with the confident posture of a man who had never once been wrong in his own estimation. He was the kind of physician who walked into a room and expected it to reorganize itself around him. And more often than not, it did, because the people around him had learned that resistance cost more energy than compliance. He had a sharp clinical mind, genuinely, and Nora had never disputed that. What she disputed, silently, internally, in the privacy of her own skull, was the way he used that mind as a license to treat everyone beneath him like a malfunctioning piece of equipment. He called her Callaway when he acknowledged her at all. More often, he didn't acknowledge her. He'd ask the charge nurse a question that Nora had already answered, or override a protocol she'd flagged without reading the note she'd written, or glance up from a chart long enough to issue a correction that wasn't actually a correction. Just a different phrasing of the same instruction she'd already given, delivered in a tone that implied she'd said something wrong. It had taken her about 3 months to understand that this wasn't negligence on his part. It was deliberate. Not necessarily conscious. She didn't think Fenn sat at home working out ways to diminish her, but deliberate in the way a habit is deliberate, automatic, efficient. The path of least resistance for a man who found it easier to dismiss than to engage. The rest of the night staff took their cues from him. The 2 second-year residents, Holloway and Park, treated her with the polite indifference of people who hadn't yet decided whether she was worth the social investment. The charge nurse, Deborah, was civil, occasionally warm, but ultimately institutional. She valued the smooth operation of the floor above all else, which meant she smoothed over Fenn's behavior the way you smooth plaster over a crack in a wall, covering it, not fixing it. There was one other nurse on nights, a travel nurse named Cressida, who'd been at Harlow 3 months and was already counting the weeks until her contract ended. Cressida had sized up the dynamic in her first week and made a strategic decision to align herself with the attending. Smart, maybe. Practical, definitely. It made her someone Nora couldn't fully trust. So Nora worked alone, in the functional sense. Did her assessments, wrote her notes, ran her checks, flagged her concerns through the proper channels, and watched most of those flags get quietly set aside. She had a system. It worked. And she told herself on the bad nights that it was enough. The man arrived at 2:31 a.m. No ambulance, no paramedics. A dark sedan had pulled up to the emergency bay. Not the entrance for walk-ins, the ambulance bay specifically, which meant whoever dropped him knew how the hospital was laid out. And the body had been pushed out onto the asphalt before the car accelerated away without stopping. The bay camera would later show a partial plate, 3 digits, the rest obscured by what looked like deliberately applied mud. The security guard on the dock, a 50-year-old veteran named Gus, had the presence of mind to hit the call button before he reached the man. That call went to Nora first because she was the one who answered call buttons during overnight lulls. She came through the bay doors at a jog, took one look at the man on the ground, and stopped. Not from shock, from processing. He was male, mid-40s, solidly built beneath clothing that looked expensive in a utilitarian way. The kind of gear you bought for function, not fashion. Dark pants, dark jacket, boots that laced high. His face was gray, not the gray of poor circulation or shock from blood loss. A different gray. Flat. Like color was being actively pulled out of him. He was convulsing in a pattern she recognized. Not the rolling rhythmic seizure of epilepsy or withdrawal. This was something else. Something organized and terrible. A rigid progressive pattern of muscle involvement that moved in a specific direction, proximal to distal, and the way his jaw was locked. The slight but visible increase in secretions at the corner of his mouth. Saliva he couldn't clear because his throat was fighting the same losing battle as the rest of him. She crouched beside him without touching him. "Gus," she said, flat and controlled, "get me 2 pairs of nitrile gloves. Double up. And tell whoever answers that I need a gurney and I need Dr. Fenn, but nobody comes through those doors until I clear it. Nobody." "What's wrong with him?" Gus asked. "Just do it," she said, still not looking up. "Please." She studied the man on the ground. No visible wounds, no smell of alcohol. Pupils, as best she could assess without a light and without leaning in too close, were pinpoint. The convulsions were rhythmic but controlled. Not a grand mal, not a tonic seizure, something in between that she'd seen described in literature she had no business having read if she was just a night shift ER nurse. The gloves came. She doubled them as she'd asked, pulled them tight, and did a rapid physical check. Scanning, not pressing, reading the surface before she committed to contact. The back of his left hand had a mark. Not a needle track. Smaller. A precise puncture, almost surgical, surrounded by a faint red halo that was already spreading toward the wrist. She sat back on her heels and took 2 seconds. 2 seconds, which was all she allowed herself. Then she stood, pulled off the outer pair of gloves, and dropped them into the biohazard bag Gus had thought to bring without being asked. She noted that, filed it away, she'd remember Gus had good instincts, and she walked back through the bay doors ahead of the gurney team. Holloway was the resident on. He looked barely awake. "What have we got?" he asked. Unknown male, mid-40s, found at the ambulance dock. No ID, no history. Presenting with progressive neuromuscular rigidity, hypersalivation, meiosis. No signs of external trauma beyond a single puncture wound, dorsal surface of the left hand, roughly 45 minutes old based on the halo spread rate. Holloway frowned. "Sounds like a bad OD. Could be fentanyl with something else mixed in. We'll run a tox panel and—" "It's not an overdose," Nora said. He looked at her. "Okay, well, I need to reach Dr. Fenn before anyone treats this patient. Fenn's in the middle of a—" "I need to reach Dr. Fenn," she said again, and there was something in her voice. Not louder, not harder, but something that stopped Holloway mid-sentence the way a change in air pressure stops you before a storm rolls in. "Right now." Yeah. Fenn arrived in the trauma bay 7 minutes later, which meant someone had communicated actual urgency rather than routine urgency. He was in scrubs, which meant he'd been napping in the on-call room. and he arrived with the aggressive alertness of a man who'd been woken unexpectedly and was going to make someone pay for it. The patient was on the gurney by then. Monitors attached. Numbers already trending somewhere Nora didn't like. "What's the emergency, Callaway?" Fenn said, not looking at her, scanning the monitor. The patient presents with a symptom cluster that's inconsistent with any common overdose presentation. The rigidity pattern is meiosis, hypersalivation, tonic muscle involvement, could be organophosphate poisoning, could be a botched street drug, could be half a dozen things. He was pulling on gloves, reaching for the chart Holloway had started. "We'll run a full panel, push fluids, get up." "Don't touch him," Nora said. The room went quiet. Fenn turned around very slowly. He had a specific look he deployed in moments like this. Not anger exactly, more like the expression of a man who had just been presented with something beneath his dignity and was deciding how much energy to spend on it. "I'm sorry?" "If you make physical contact with that patient without additional PPE and a proper barrier protocol, you risk secondary exposure." She kept her voice even. "That puncture wound on his hand is a delivery site. What's in his system is still active. The ambient concentration in a room this size, with the current ventilation rate, Callaway." The word landed like a door slamming. "This is an emergency department, not a chemistry lab. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but you don't have the training to—" "His heart rate just dropped to 42, she said. Everyone looked at the monitor. 42. Declining. "That's not a drug reaction," she said, but that's a specific pharmacological signature. And if you treat it as a standard tox case, you will give him atropine at the wrong dosage for the wrong reason, and he will code before you understand what you're dealing with." Fenn stared at her for a moment. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite uncertainty. Marcus Fenn didn't do uncertainty, not publicly, but something adjacent to it, a flicker. Then he set it aside. "Get me the crash cart," he said to Holloway, "and somebody remove Nurse Callaway from this bay." "I have pralidoxime," Nora said. Silence again. "In my locker," she said. 2 vials. The dosage for this presentation is Y, Fenn said, and his voice had gone very careful, very controlled. "Would a night shift ER nurse have pralidoxime in her personal locker?" It was a good question. Nora knew it was a good question. She also knew they were running out of time. "Let me treat him," she said. "Ask me about my locker later." "Absolutely not. Holloway, get security." Nora had already turned and was walking out of the trauma bay. Not running. Walking. With the precise economical gait of someone who knows exactly how many steps they have and exactly how much time each step costs. Deborah caught her in the hallway. Nora, stop. Whatever you're doing, stop." "I need 2 minutes. Fenn is going to have you terminated. Do you understand what I'm saying? This isn't a write-up. This is—" "Deborah." Nora stopped and looked at her. "If he treats that patient the way he's planning to treat him, the patient dies. That's the simple version. There's a more complicated version that involves the rest of this department, but let's start there." Deborah's face went through several things very quickly. She was a practical woman, a good charge nurse, someone who had built her competence on the ability to read situations accurately. She read this one. "What do you need?" she said quietly. 2 minutes and nobody stopping me." Deborah looked down the hall, then back at Nora. "Go!" Her locker was in the staff room at the end of the north corridor. Combination lock, personal items, nothing that should have drawn attention, and for 4 years it hadn't. She spun the dial, pulled out the small insulated case she kept behind her civvies, checked the vials with the quick efficiency of long practice, and was back in the hallway before the 2 minutes were up. She pushed through the trauma bay doors with the vials in her hand and Deborah behind her, and the knowledge that what she was about to do was going to permanently alter something she'd spent 4 years carefully constructing. The patient's heart rate was at 38. Holloway was on the phone, Fenn was at the medication cart, and he turned when the doors opened and his face went dark. "Callaway, I told security—" 38 and dropping, she said, reading the monitor as she walked to the bedside. "You have about 90 seconds before he goes into complete block. Do not touch that patient." She drew up the first vial, checked it again. The dosage calculation was already complete in her head, had been complete since the ambulance bay, since she'd assessed his weight, and the spread rate and the symptom timeline. Callaway, if you inject that patient, I will have you arrested. She injected the patient. The room held its breath. 10 seconds. 20. The monitor's tone shifted, not dramatically, not the cinematic flatline to thundering rhythm of a television rescue, just a small, measurable change. The rate ticked upward. 39, 41, 45. The rigidity in the patient's jaw visibly eased, a fractional softening that only Nora and anyone who'd been watching closely enough would notice. 50 beats. Climbing. Fenn stood very still. Callaway was staring at the monitor. Nora administered the second vial at the correct interval. 60 seconds. Not 50, not 70, 60, and stepped back from the gurney. The antidote needs about 8 minutes to reach therapeutic concentration, she said, to no one specifically, to the room. After that, his vitals should stabilize. He'll need continuous monitoring for the next 6 hours, and he should not receive any anticholinergics regardless of presentation, because it will reverse the treatment. I've written the protocol on the chart. Nobody spoke. The monitor climbed steadily. 58, 62, 67. Fenn's face had gone through several stages in the past 90 seconds. She'd watched it peripherally, not directly. She'd learned a long time ago that watching a man like Fenn process humiliation directly was the wrong move because it gave him something to react to. So she'd watched the monitor and she'd let him stand in the room with what had just happened, and she'd waited. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. "Get out of my department." "I understand," Nora said. "You are suspended pending a full disciplinary review. You will surrender your badge to security, and you will not return to this floor." "I understand," she said again, the same tone. Not submission, not defiance. Just acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge bad weather. "It's happening. Noted." She pulled off her gloves, dropped them in the biohazard receptacle, picked up her pen from the counter where she'd set it, and slid it into her pocket. She was almost to the bay doors when Callaway said quietly, almost involuntarily, "How did you know?" She paused, didn't turn around. "The rigidity pattern," she said, "and the puncture site, and the fact that nobody drops a man at a hospital loading dock at 2:30 in the morning unless they're trying to save his life but can't afford to explain why." She went through the doors. The hallway outside was quiet. The fluorescent lights were the same. The linoleum was the same. She could hear the ventilation system, low and constant, and the distant sound of a phone ringing at the nurse's station, and her own footsteps, and nothing else. She didn't go to her locker. She went to the window at the end of the corridor, the one that faced north, overlooking the hospital's secondary parking structure, and she stood there for a moment and looked out at the dark. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That wasn't something she'd had to work at. But she noticed them anyway. The way you notice a thing you've relied on for a long time after a moment that tested it. The man in that room was alive. That was the only thing that mattered tonight, and she knew it. And she stood at the window and let herself have that for exactly 30 seconds before the sound of the elevator changed, and she turned around. The elevator at the end of the hall had opened. 6 men stepped out. They wore dark tactical gear. Not SWAT, not local PD, something with a different posture and different equipment and different patches on the arms that weren't any local agency she recognized. They moved with the fluid, unhurried efficiency of people who trained for exactly this kind of entry and had nothing to prove to anyone present. 2 of them peeled off toward the nurse's station. 2 more headed for the stairwell exit doors. The remaining 2, the one in front with a radio at his shoulder and the one behind him carrying what looked like a portable air sampling unit, walked directly toward the trauma bay. The one in front stopped when he saw her. Not because she was in his way, she'd stepped to the side. He stopped because he'd been looking for something and he'd found it, and the calculation on his face was not hostile but very, very focused. "Ma'am," he said, "this floor is being restricted. You'll need to I'm aware," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. "What agent?" he said, and it wasn't a question he'd have asked a regular nurse. She told him. His expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. The slight recalibration of a man who's received information that changes the shape of the problem he's working. How long ago was initial exposure for the patient? based on the puncture site and spread rate? Approximately 50 to 60 minutes before he arrived here, which means he was held somewhere for 20 to 30 minutes before transport. She paused. He wasn't just poisoned and dumped. Someone was trying to decide something, and then they decided to bring him here. That suggests they knew the agent and knew the treatment window. The tactical officer studied her for a long moment. Then he lifted his radio. "Command, this is Reyes. We have a situation on 4. Advise the secondary team to hold position." He clicked off and looked at her again. "Who are you?" Nora Callaway looked at him steadily. "Right now?" she said. "I'm a suspended nurse." Down the hall, she could hear the trauma bay doors opening. She could hear Fenn's voice, raised in the particular register of a man who is very important and has just been told he cannot go somewhere. She could hear the monitors, still steady, still climbing. And beneath it all, barely audible through the floor, she thought she could hear something else. A low vibration, rhythmic, approaching. But she wasn't sure yet if it was real or if she was anticipating it. She turned back to the window. The parking structure to the north was empty, but the sky above it, very far off, was beginning to pulse with the unmistakable thrum of rotor blades. The rotor sound wasn't her imagination. It built slowly at first, the way thunder does, a pressure more than a noise. And then it was everywhere, bouncing off the parking structure and rattling the north-facing windows and drawing every nurse and orderly on the 4th floor out into the corridor to press their faces against the glass like kids watching a parade. 3 helicopters. Military configuration. Running lights only, no search beams, and they came in low and fast over the tree line north of the hospital, and then slowed into a tight hover above the roof of the adjacent medical office building before one peeled off toward the main parking lot and the other 2 held position. Nobody in that hallway said anything for a moment. Then Cressida, the travel nurse, said, "What the hell?" And it was the most honest thing anyone had said on the 4th floor in hours. Reyes was already back on his radio, moving toward the stairwell, gesturing to the agent behind him to hold the floor. He glanced at Nora once as he passed, and it was the kind of glance that meant he wasn't done with her. He was just doing something else first. She stayed at the window. Below, in the main lot, she could see vehicles pulling in, dark SUVs, moving with the organized precision of a convoy, not the random scatter of civilian traffic. 4 of them. Then a 5th. They fanned out across the lot without apparent coordination, which meant the coordination was happening somewhere else, through channels she wasn't hearing. Deborah appeared at her elbow. "Nora." Her voice was low and tight. "What is happening?" "I don't know exactly." "That's not good enough." "No," Nora agreed. "It's not." Down the hall, she could hear Fenn. She could always hear Fenn when he was at volume. It was one of the unfortunate acoustics of the 4th floor, demanding that someone explain the chain of authority here and what exactly gave these people the right to restrict movement in a private medical facility. She heard a voice she didn't recognize respond to him in a tone that was professionally patient and absolutely immovable. She'd heard that tone before. It was the tone of someone who had the authority and didn't need to prove it. She turned away from the window. "I need to get back to that bay," she said. "You're suspended." "Deborah, I can't let you—" Deborah stopped herself. The same calculation she'd made in the hallway 20 minutes ago was running again behind her eyes, and it landed in the same place. The agent. That man in the bay. You think it's serious? "I think those helicopters aren't here for a routine welfare check." Deborah looked at the window, then back at Nora. She reached up and unclipped the secondary badge from her lanyard, the visitor access card she carried as charge nurse coded for all floors. She held it out. "I didn't give you that," she said. Nora took it. The trauma bay was a different room than the one she'd left. That was the only way to describe it. The physical space was identical. Same equipment, same layout, same overhead lighting. But the atmosphere had shifted in the way a room shifts when people inside it have stopped performing confidence and started experiencing something they didn't expect. Holloway was standing against the far wall with his arms crossed, not in defiance, in the posture of someone who's been told to stay put and is complying because he doesn't know what else to do. 2 of Reyes's people had set up equipment near the patient's bedside. The air sampling unit was running, its small display showing numbers that meant nothing to Holloway and everything to Nora when she read them from the door. The patient was stable, still unconscious, but his color had changed, some of the gray walking back, the monitors showing a rhythm that was holding. Someone had intubated him, probably Holloway before the team arrived, and the placement looked good from where she stood. The agent who'd been left on the floor, she'd heard Reyes call him Kadir in passing, looked up when she came in. "This floor is restricted," he said, but he said it without moving toward her, which meant he'd been told something about her. "I know," she said. "I need to check the patient." "You need to wait for—" "His pralidoxime window is closing," she said. "If his acetylcholinesterase levels aren't where they need to be in the next 40 minutes, the second phase of treatment won't work and everything I did in the last hour was for nothing." She walked to the bedside. "You can stand right there and watch. I'm not going anywhere." Kadir watched her. He was younger than Reyes. Late 20s, she guessed, with the careful stillness of someone trained not to react. He made a decision and stayed where he was. She checked the patient's pupils. Better. Still constricted, but responsive in a way they hadn't been an hour ago. His jaw had relaxed completely, the secretions controlled, his airway clear. She read his chart, what there was of it, which wasn't much because he had no identity yet, and ran her own mental calculation against Holloway's notes. There was one line that stopped her. Holloway had documented a secondary finding, noted almost as an afterthought in the physical exam section, probably because it seemed unrelated. A faded tattoo on the patient's inner left forearm, partially obscured by the medical tape holding his IV line. The notation read, "Tattoo, military-style insignia, partially visible, no further detail." She lifted the tape carefully at the edge, not removing it, just shifting it, and looked. The tattoo was old. 10, maybe 15 years. The kind of fading that happens when something gets put on young skin and the skin ages around it. It was a small design, compact, not decorative. An eagle above a horizontal blade above a number she couldn't fully read because part of it was under the tape, but she could see the first 2 digits. She let the tape settle back. Her hands were still steady. She checked that specifically. "Who found him?" she asked Kadir. "What? Who initiated the call that sent your team here? Because you didn't respond to our triage report. We didn't file one. There wasn't time. Something else triggered your deployment." She straightened up, looked at him directly. "What was it?" Kadir said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "Okay," she said. She picked up the chart, made 2 additions in the medication log, noted the time, and set it back. She was almost to the door when it opened and Reyes came through it with a woman she hadn't seen before, 40 or so, civilian clothes, but with the exact same posture as Reyes, the same trained economy of movement, the kind of physical bearing that doesn't come from desk work. The woman looked at Nora for a long moment, not the way Fenn looked at her, not assessment as dismissal. This was just assessment. "You're Callaway," she said. "Yes." "Dr. Fenn says you assaulted a patient." "Dr. Fenn says a lot of things." The corner of the woman's mouth moved, maybe. Hard to tell. "He's filing a formal complaint with the hospital administrator and demanding your credentials be reviewed. He's also claiming you introduced an unapproved substance to a patient in his care without authorization." She tilted her head. "Would you like to respond to that?" "The patient's alive," Nora said. "You can check the chart." "We are checking the chart." She stepped further into the room. "I'm Voss, Federal Task Coordinator. I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them honestly, because we don't have a lot of time tonight, and I'm not interested in the version where you're careful about what you tell me." "I understand." "Good." Voss looked at the patient, then back at Nora. "Where did you get the pralidoxime?" Nora had known this question was coming since the ambulance bay. She'd had time to decide how to answer it, and she'd decided on the truth, because the truth was the fastest route through this, and she could feel the clock running even if she didn't know yet exactly what it was counting down toward. "I keep a small emergency kit," she said. "Personal. Off book." "Off book," Voss repeated. "It's not something a standard ER nurse would carry. I know that. But I'm not exactly a standard ER nurse, and tonight that turned out to matter." Voss looked at her for a long moment. "What are you then?" The question hung in the room. Nora looked at the patient, at the tattoo covered by medical tape, at the monitors showing a heart that was holding, a body that had come closer to the edge than anyone in this building had understood except her. "I'm whoever kept that man alive," she said. "We can get to the rest later." Voss studied her with the expression of someone filing information for future use. "We will," she said. Then to Reyes, "Get me the secondary sweep results, and get the floor cleared. I want everyone except essential medical staff in the conference room on 3. Reyes moved, Kadir moved, and Nora was left standing at the bedside with Voss, and the sound of the ventilation system and the steady beep of the monitors. "He's going to make it," Nora said. "Not to Voss exactly, just to the room." "Maybe," Voss said. "If what we think is happening, he might wish he hadn't." Nora didn't ask what she meant. Not yet. The conference room on 3 had a long table, 12 chairs, and a whiteboard someone had covered with a sheet. Every member of the night staff who wasn't actively running a code or managing a critical patient had been directed there, and they sat in the particular silence of people who have been told to wait without being told why. Which was the worst kind of waiting, the kind that runs every possible explanation through the brain's internal filter until anxiety fills the spaces that information hasn't. Nora was not in the conference room. Voss had not told her to go there, and Nora had not gone. She was in the hallway outside the trauma bay, sitting on the floor against the wall with her back to the baseboard and her knees up and her eyes on the door, and she was thinking. The tattoo. The 2 digits she'd seen. The way the patient had been delivered. Targeted, deliberate, someone who knew the loading dock layout. The specific agent used and the specific delivery method. A precision puncture, not casual poisoning, not a street drug that had gone wrong. This was designed. This was administered by someone who knew what they were doing. The question wasn't what he'd been poisoned with. The question was why he'd been kept alive long enough to be delivered. Because the man had been held, she was almost certain of it. 20 to 30 minutes between poisoning and arrival, based on the biochemical markers. If someone had wanted him dead, he would have been dead before the car ever reached the hospital parking lot. You didn't hold someone in the early window of a nerve agent exposure unless you were waiting for something. A decision. A communication. An instruction that arrived and said not yet, and then a subsequent instruction that said now, take him somewhere he might survive. Someone had changed their mind about this man, or someone else had changed it for them. The bay door opened and Reyes came out. He almost stepped over her before he noticed her on the floor, and he stopped. And there was a brief, almost human moment of surprise on his face before the professional composure closed over it again. "You should be in the conference room," he said. "I know." He looked at her. She looked at him. He sat down. Not against the wall. He stayed on his feet, but he crouched, which brought them to eye level, and he lowered his voice to something that wasn't quite private but was quieter than strictly necessary. "The air sampling unit picked up trace contamination in the ambulance bay," he said. "Consistent with what you identified." "I know. I saw the readings." "We're expanding the perimeter." "How far?" He didn't answer directly, which meant farther than he was going to tell her. "The hospital's locked. Nobody in or out until we complete the secondary sweep. We have a decontamination team on the way." "And the people who were in the bay when he came in?" "Being assessed." "Gus," she said, "the security guard who found him. He was in contact before I got there. We have him. He's probably fine. The ambient exposure at that point would have been minimal, but watch for fasciculations. If he starts showing muscle twitching in the hands or forearms, he needs treatment within the hour." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "You trained in chemical casualty care." It wasn't quite a question. "I trained in a lot of things," she said. He let that sit. Then, "Voss is going to want more than that." "I know," Nora said. "So will Fenn, for different reasons." She looked at the bay door. "What's his name?" "The patient." "We don't know yet." "The tattoo on his arm, inner left forearm, faded, eagle-over-blade design. Does that mean anything to your team?" Something happened in Reyes's expression, a slight compression, the kind of micro-adjustment that happens when someone receives information they recognize and are deciding how to respond to. "Where did you see that?" he said. "I was assessing him. It was visible during the IV placement." He stood up slowly. His radio crackled and he silenced it and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and she watched him work through something. She'd gotten good over the years at watching people work through things without interrupting, because interrupting that process usually got you the decision they'd made before they'd finished thinking, and that decision was almost always wrong. "Stay here," he said finally. "Where would I go?" He went back into the bay. She stayed on the floor. The hallway was quieter now that the staff had been cleared to 3. The phones at the nursing station were ringing and going unanswered, which meant someone had forwarded them somewhere, and the ambient sounds of a functioning emergency floor had reduced to just the ventilation system and the distant sound of the decontamination team setting up in the bay, moving equipment with the careful deliberateness of people who take contamination seriously. She was tired. She noticed that specifically. Not the abstract end-of-shift tired she usually carried home, but a particular tiredness that came from having made a decision with large consequences and not yet knowing the full shape of those consequences. Her back hurt from the floor. She thought about standing up and didn't. 12 minutes passed. The bay door opened again, and this time it was Voss. And Voss had a different energy than she'd had before. Not agitation. Voss didn't seem like someone who did agitation, but a focused intensity that had ratcheted up a notch from their earlier conversation. She had a tablet in her hand and she crouched in front of Nora, the way Reyes had, and she held the tablet out so Nora could see the screen. The image on it was the tattoo. High-resolution photo taken in the last 20 minutes, and beside it was a database entry, mostly redacted, long gray bars covering the text, but the header was visible. Nora read it. She kept her face neutral. "You recognize it," Voss said. "The unit designation," Nora said carefully. "Yes." "How?" The question was quiet and direct, and it deserved a straight answer. And Nora sat on the floor of the hallway in a hospital she'd worked in for 4 years, under the fluorescent lights that still didn't give her headaches, and she made a decision that she'd been postponing for a long time. "Because I worked alongside that unit," she said. "A long time ago. In a different context." "What context?" "A classified one." She held Voss's eyes. "Which means you either have the clearance to pull the file and verify what I'm telling you, or you don't. And if you don't, there's a number I can give you." Voss stared at her for a long moment. "Give me the number," she said. Nora gave it to her. Voss stood up, stepped away, and made a call that lasted 4 minutes. Nora heard none of it. Voss moved to the far end of the corridor. But she watched the shape of the conversation from a distance, watched Voss's posture shift once about 90 seconds in, a slight adjustment in how she was holding the phone, and that told her enough. Voss came back. She didn't crouch this time. She stood, and she looked at Nora from above, and she said, "You have a record." "I have a file," Nora said. "There's a difference." "It's sealed." "Yes." "At a classification level that took me 3 minutes to reach, and another minute to get verbal confirmation that I was looking at the right person." Voss paused. "Callaway." "Yes." "That's not your name." A very long beat. "It's the name I work under," Nora said. Something shifted in the corridor, not the lighting, not the sound, just the quality of the space between the two of them, which had been professional and cautious and was now something else. Reoriented, like a map that's been turned to match the terrain you're actually standing in. "What do I call you?" Voss asked. Nora thought about it for a moment. The honest answer she'd carried a long time. The working answer she'd carried 4 years. Both were real. Both were hers. "Tonight?" she said. "Call me whatever gets us through the next few hours." Voss looked at her for another beat, and then she did something unexpected. She almost smiled. It didn't fully materialize, but it was close. The look of someone who has spent a career managing complexity and has just been handed a particular variety of it that they didn't anticipate. "Get up," Voss said. "I need you in that room." Nora got up. Her knees protested. She ignored them. She followed Voss back through the bay doors and into the controlled chaos of the space beyond, the team moving, the equipment running, the monitors steady, and she was halfway to the patient's bedside when the man's eyes opened. Not dramatically, not all at once. A slow, labored rise, the eyes finding focus the way they do coming out of something deep and pharmaceutical, the world assembling itself in fragments. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the tubes. He looked at Nora, and his mouth moved. She leaned in, because whatever he was going to say, it wasn't going to be loud. His voice was barely a sound, a breath with shape to it, and she had to get close enough that she could feel the words more than hear them. 2 words. She stood back up. Her face was doing something she couldn't completely control. Not panic, not shock, but the involuntary response to a specific kind of information, the kind that changes the size of the problem you're standing inside. Voss was watching her. What did he say? Nora looked at the monitors, at the patient, at Reyes, who had gone very still at the edge of the room. He said transit ventilation, she said. Nobody moved for a moment. He said transit ventilation, Nora said again, clearly, because some information needs to be said twice to be real. Which means whatever he was carrying isn't the weapon. Whatever he was carrying is the signal. She turned to face Voss. And we need to know exactly how many hours we have before someone who isn't in this room pulls the trigger. Voss moved first. She crossed to Reyes in 3 steps and said something low and fast that Nora didn't catch. And Reyes had his radio up before Voss finished the sentence. The bass shifted from controlled urgency to something faster and less comfortable. The particular energy of people who have been operating on one set of assumptions and have just had those assumptions replaced. Nora stayed at the patient's bedside. He'd lost consciousness again, the effort of those 2 words apparently the entire reserve he'd had, and his eyes had closed with the slow finality of someone going under for a second time. His vitals were holding, barely, but holding, and she adjusted the drip rate on his IV by a small, precise amount, not because the protocol required it, but because she could see the early signs of a pressure drop and she wanted to get ahead of it rather than chase it. Callaway. Voss was back at her shoulder. Transit ventilation. What does that mean specifically? The Central Transit Authority in Denton runs a unified HVAC system across all underground stations on the main line. 4 stations, all connected through the same intake and distribution network. She kept her eyes on the monitor. If you introduce a sufficient quantity of a volatile agent at the primary intake, which is located at the Denton Central Depot, maintenance level, the distribution cycle pushes it through all 4 stations within approximately 22 minutes of peak circulation. Morning rush hour, you'd have 15 to 20,000 people moving through those stations in a 90-minute window. You know the system specs? I know a lot of systems in this city. She looked at Voss. The agent our patient was carrying, Machan, the compound in his bloodstream, it's not the weapon, you're right about that. It's the proof of concept version. A demonstration dose, probably used to verify delivery viability before the main release. She paused. Which means someone already tested the agent, and then they poisoned the person who ran the test because he knew too much. Voss absorbed this. Timeline. Morning rush starts in approximately 4 hours and 11 minutes. Peak circulation at Central Depot is between 6:45 and 7:30. She looked at the clock on the wall. If the attack is coordinated with peak circulation, we have until 6:15 before they'd need to initiate the release sequence. That's 3 hours and 40 minutes. Approximately. It could be less if they moved the timeline up after losing their operative, which they may have done the moment that car dropped him at our dock. She finally turned to face Voss directly. Someone on that network knows he was delivered to a hospital. They've been burning time ever since. Voss turned away and pulled out her phone, and for the next 90 seconds she talked to someone in a voice that was clipped and technical and left no room for questions. When she hung up, she stood still for a moment with the phone in her hand. I need everything you know about the agent's stability profile at different temperatures, she said. Volatile above 68 degrees, degradation accelerates above 80. Below 50, it becomes inert but doesn't denature. You can restabilize it with heat. Underground transit systems run between 62 and 71 degrees, depending on the station. Nora thought for a moment. The primary intake at Central Depot would be the optimal release point because the air temperature there is consistently in the high 60s, right in the agent's stable range. But there's a secondary intake at the Millward Street station that connects to the same main duct system. We'd need to cover both. You'd need to cover both simultaneously. If they see movement at Central, they'll shift to Millward. Reyes had been listening from across the room, and he crossed to them now. His face had the compressed, focused look of someone managing a rapidly expanding operational picture and choosing which pieces to prioritize. "We have a strike team that came in with the second helicopter," he said. 8 operators. We can split and cover both sites. 8 operators split across 2 sites with an unknown number of people on the other side, and a civilian transit system that starts activating its overnight maintenance staff in, Nora checked the clock, about 40 minutes. She shook her head. You'd be moving through an occupied space with limited field of view, subterranean, no natural light, constrained corridors, maintenance personnel who don't know to stay clear. That's not an assault problem, that's a coordination problem. "What's the difference?" Reyes said. "The difference is that if your team breaches incorrectly, the people with the agent panic and release it early, and then you're running a mass casualty response in an underground space with no ventilation override and 8 operators who are now in a hot zone with whatever protective gear they brought." She looked at him evenly. "I need to see a layout of both sites before anyone moves." Reyes glanced at Voss. Something passed between them. Not quite a question, not quite an answer, more like a confirmation of a conclusion they were reaching independently. "She's right," Voss said simply. Reyes didn't argue. He pulled out a tablet and started making calls. They set up in the family consultation room across the hall from the trauma bay because it was the largest private space on the floor and because it had a wall-mounted screen that Kadir managed to connect to a tactical feed within 8 minutes, which Nora thought was impressively fast. The room normally held chairs arranged in a soft circle for conversations nobody wanted to have, and they pushed those to the walls and replaced them with standing space and a folding table that one of the team members had carried up from somewhere. The station blueprints came through at 3:19 a.m. Nora stood at the screen and looked at the Denton Central Depot maintenance level for the first time since she'd memorized it under entirely different circumstances, a long time ago, and the layout was mostly unchanged. Same primary intake configuration, same corridor structure. The secondary access point relocated about 12 meters north of where it had been, a renovation that the blueprints dated to 18 months ago. "The primary intake is here," she said, touching the screen. "There's a maintenance corridor that runs parallel to the main duct for about 40 meters. That's your access problem, because anyone approaching the intake from the standard maintenance entrance has to move through those 40 meters in a straight line with no concealment and at least 2 camera positions." She traced the route. "But there's a utility shaft that connects the maintenance level to the platform level at this junction, here. If your team comes down through the platform, which they can access from the street entrance after hours using a transit authority override, they can reach the intake room from the east, which cuts the exposure corridor from 40 meters to 8. "Where's the camera coverage on that approach?" Reyes asked. "Platform cameras face north toward the tracks and south toward the fare gates. The east utility shaft is a maintenance access point. It's not on the camera grid because it's not a public area. The transit authority never bothered to put coverage there." She paused. "At least they hadn't as of 3 years ago." "Is that how you know the layout?" Voss asked from the corner of the room, and her voice was genuinely curious rather than pointed. 3 years ago. "I know it because it was my job to know it," Nora said, and she left it at that. Voss left it there too. The operation planning took 41 minutes. Nora stood at the screen for most of it, answering questions, redirecting approaches that had gaps, flagging timing problems. The team, she'd gotten names by now, a partial roster, Reyes and Kadir, and a woman named Sato, who handled tactical communications, and 2 others whose names she hadn't caught, were competent and serious, and they listened when she spoke, which was different from most of the rooms she'd been in for the past 4 years. It was a different feeling. She noticed it and set it aside. At 3:52 a.m., Reyes stepped out to finalize team deployment, and Voss came to stand beside Nora at the table. "You need to tell me who you are," Voss said. Not aggressively, practically. "You already ran my file." "I ran what I could access, which was a name I can't repeat in this room, a service record that goes dark after year 6, and a commendation that's classified above my current clearance level." She looked at Nora directly. That's a lot of blank space. Yes, Nora agreed. Why Denton? Why a hospital? Why this particular... Because I was tired, Nora said. And then because that was true but not complete. And because there were things I needed to be close to, reasons I can't explain in the current context. She looked at the table. I wasn't hiding exactly. I was just being somewhere that wasn't the other thing. Voss was quiet for a moment. Does it work? Being someone else? It was a surprisingly human question from someone who had spent the last hour being nothing but operational. Some nights, Nora said. The door opened and Reyes came back in, and he had someone with him who hadn't been there before. A man in civilian clothes who'd clearly arrived on the helicopters based on his gear, late 40s, with the kind of face that didn't give much away but gave some things away to people who knew what to look for. He looked at the room, assessed it quickly, and his eyes stopped on Nora. Captain, he said. The room shifted. Not physically. The walls didn't move, the table didn't move, Reyes and Voss didn't move, but something in the atmosphere of the space adjusted, the way it had in the hallway earlier when the map got reoriented, and Nora stood very still at the center of it. Colonel Marsh, she said. James Marsh looked older than she remembered. Not by much. He'd always looked older than his years, something about the eyes, the specific kind of fatigue that accumulated in people who ran things that couldn't be discussed over dinner. But there were lines in his face now that hadn't been there, and his hair, which had been iron gray when she'd last seen him, had gone to something closer to white at the temples. I wasn't sure you'd still be in Denton, he said. I wasn't sure you knew I was here. We keep track of our people. I'm not your people anymore. She said it without heat. It was just a fact. I separated, the record reflects that. The record reflects what it needed to reflect, he said, which was not the same thing. He crossed the room to the table, looked at the blueprints. You've been briefing the team. Someone had to. Yes. He looked at the station layout. I understand you saved the operative's life. He's not secure yet. He could still crash. But he's alive. For now. Marsh studied the blueprints in silence for a moment. Reyes and Voss and Kadir and Sato all occupied different corners of the room with the professional body language of people who are present, but have concluded that the most important conversation in the space is not theirs. The cell, Nora said. What do you know about it? Enough to be here at 4 a.m. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. He straightened up. The cell has been active in the Pacific Northwest for 14 months. 3 previous operations, all disrupted at varying stages. This is their 4th, and it's different from the others. How? The previous 3 were probing, testing response times, testing coverage gaps, testing logistics. This one has the agent, this one has the delivery mechanism in place. This one has... He paused, and she recognized that pause. The small hesitation before he said something that had operational implications he hadn't finished processing. An inside component. The room was very quiet. Inside where? Nora said. Marsh looked at her steadily. The transit authority. Someone with access to the maintenance scheduling system altered the overnight work orders to pull staff from the central depot between 4 and 6 a.m., created a window. How long have you known? We confirmed it 40 minutes ago, which is why the timeline is what it is. Nora worked through the implications. The inside person would know your response protocols, would know which transit authority contacts to use for a legitimate override. She looked at the platform approach she'd mapped on the screen. If they're monitoring the transit system's own feeds, they'll see your team accessing the platform entrance regardless of which approach you use. Yes, Marsh said. We know. You need someone who can access the maintenance level without triggering the transit authority's own system. We're working on that. I know the manual bypass for the ventilation intake room, she said, the hardwired override that's not on any digital system. It was installed during a retrofit about 5 years ago, and it was never fully integrated into the main control network because the contractor ran out of budget. She looked at Marsh. You'd have to be in the room to use it, but if you can get someone there, you can shut down the primary intake manually and prevent a release even if the cell initiates. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. You'd have to be in the room, he said. Yes. That's a tactical problem. I know how to get there without going through the camera-covered approach or the transit authority's access system. She met his eyes. I know a way in that isn't on those blueprints. Another pause, different from his earlier ones. Nora, he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name, and the sound of it in this room was strange and oddly weighted, carrying things she'd put down a long time ago. You're a civilian. I'm a nurse, she said. Apparently. Something moved across his face. Not quite amusement, not the right moment for that, but something that acknowledged the absurdity they were both standing inside. I can't send you in, he said. You're not sending me. I'm telling you what I know and what I can do, and then making a decision for myself. She looked at the clock. We have 3 hours and 8 minutes. If someone from your team goes in through any documented access point, the inside contact flags it and we lose the window. If someone goes in my way, nobody flags anything because nobody knows it exists. She paused. What's the alternative? Marsh was quiet. Voss, from the corner, she's right. Marsh looked at Voss, then back at Nora. He had the face of a man who has spent a career making decisions with incomplete information under time pressure and who has learned that the thing you most want to delay is usually the thing you need to decide right now. Show me, he said, the access route. Show me exactly. She showed him. It took 11 minutes to walk him through it on the blueprints and another 9 to address the specific questions Reyes raised about timing and the coordination with the strike team covering the Millward Street secondary. By the end, the outline of the operation was clear, and it was fragile in the specific ways that all real operations were fragile, dependent on timing, on the accuracy of the intelligence they had, on the inside person not having already escalated to a contingency plan they hadn't anticipated. At 4:14 a.m., Marsh made a series of calls that Nora didn't hear because she was back in the trauma bay checking on the patient, who was holding, still unconscious, his blood pressure stable at a level she was cautiously satisfied with. She stood at his bedside for a minute, looked at the tattoo under the tape, looked at his face, which she didn't recognize, which meant he'd come in after her time, one of the people who'd filled the space she'd left behind. What did you see? She asked him quietly, knowing he couldn't answer. Before they burned you. The monitors answered for him, steady rhythm, even breathing. She made one small adjustment to his positioning, checked his airway, and left. They moved at 4:31 a.m. Nora in plain clothes, her own jacket from her locker, dark, nondescript, with Reyes and a second operator named Taft bracketing her. Marsh had conceded the point and then spent 10 minutes establishing conditions. She would guide them to the access route, and then Reyes would make the call on her proximity to the intake room based on what they found when they got there. It was a reasonable compromise, and she'd agreed to it because she'd been in enough situations to know that reasonable compromises made before an operation were worth holding on to, because everything after entry was improvised. The vehicles took them south from the hospital through streets that were nearly empty at this hour. A few delivery trucks, a cab, the city's pre-dawn skeleton. The transit authority's public access to the central depot was dark, as expected, and they bypassed it by 2 blocks and came in from the east through a maintenance corridor that predated the current structure by 40 years. A utility passage originally built for an infrastructure project that had been partially completed and then abandoned, which meant it existed in the physical city without existing in any current database. Nora knew about it because someone had told her, a long time ago, in a context that had seemed abstract at the time. She'd filed it away in the category of things you probably wouldn't need and shouldn't forget. The passage was low and damp and smelled of concrete and slow water and the particular staleness of enclosed spaces that hadn't moved air in years. Taft had a light. They moved single file, Nora in the middle, and she counted steps the way she'd been trained to count them, building the geometry of the space in her head, updating her mental map against the physical reality. The passage connected to the depot maintenance level through an access point that looked, from the outside, like a sealed utility junction. From the inside, if you knew what you were pressing and in what sequence, It was a door. It opened without sound. The maintenance level of Denton Central was lit with low-level operational lighting, amber strips along the base of the walls, enough to see without being seen by anything looking down from above. The corridor ahead was clear. The air temperature was, as she'd estimated, in the high 60s. She could feel the ventilation system, not hear it exactly, but feel it. The pressure differential that meant the primary intake was active and drawing. Reyes held up a fist. They stopped. He looked at her. She pointed. 40 meters, East Junction, left branch. The intake room was at the end of the second corridor. He held up 3 fingers, counted down. They moved. 20 meters of clear corridor. 30, the junction. Left branch, narrower, the amber lighting giving way to standard fluorescent, and then to something else. A faint, different light from under the door at the end of the corridor. Not operational lighting, handheld, moving. Someone was in the intake room. Reyes stopped them again, 8 meters from the door, and pulled Nora back behind Taft. He went forward alone, measured steps, his body language reading the door, the gap at the base, the light movement, the absence of sound. He held up 4 fingers, dropped 1, held up 3. His estimate of how many were inside. Nora watched from behind Taft's shoulder and thought, 3 people in a room with the primary ventilation intake, at 4:47 in the morning, 13 minutes ahead of the window she'd calculated. They'd moved up the timeline, which meant either they'd been spooked, the hospital, the operative, something, or they'd never intended to wait for peak circulation, which meant the casualty projection she'd based on rush hour numbers was wrong, and the actual window was being driven by something else, something she didn't have, and the number of people currently in the station's overnight maintenance rotation. She heard it before she saw it, a sound from the passage behind them, not footsteps. Something smaller. A click, metallic, precise, and very close. She turned. The man in the maintenance corridor was standing 10 meters back, in the shadow between 2 amber strips, and he had something in his hand that was not a radio and not a phone, and his eyes, when they found hers, had the particular flat quality of someone who has already made their decision. He raised his arm. Nora dropped. The sound that followed was not what she expected. Not the crack of a firearm, but something duller, a compressed burst. And she felt the air displacement above her head, and then Taft's weight coming down over her, and then nothing but the floor, and the smell of concrete, and the vibration of the ventilation system beneath her palms, pulling air through the city at 68 degrees, 300 meters from where it would become something catastrophic. And somewhere ahead of her, through the door at the end of the corridor, a sound she recognized with a cold and very specific certainty, the mechanical sequence of a pressurized release valve being armed. The floor was cold against her palms, and she stayed flat for exactly 1 second. 1 deliberate second, not from paralysis, but from the trained instinct to assess before moving, because moving wrong in the first second after contact was how people died in the second second. Taft was down beside her, not on top of her. He dropped simultaneously, a trained response to the same threat input, and he was already rolling to his left, away from the line of fire, his body doing what his body had been drilled to do. She couldn't see Reyes. He'd been ahead of them when she turned, closer to the intake room door, and she couldn't see him in the current geometry of the corridor. The man with the weapon in the passage behind them was still there. She knew because she could hear him, a controlled breathing pattern, footsteps, measured, unhurried, someone who'd done this before. The compressed burst sound had been a suppressed weapon, small caliber by the sound displacement, and the shot had gone high because she'd dropped, which meant he'd aimed center mass at standing height and adjusted for her drop, and the adjustment window was closing. She moved, not toward him. That was the wrong direction, and she had no weapon and no cover in the 10 meters between them. She moved forward toward the door, the same direction Reyes had gone, using the second of adjustment time the shooter needed to recalculate, rolling to the right, then up, then running in the low crouch she'd hated learning and never forgotten, her sneakers quiet on the concrete. The second shot hit the wall to her left. The door at the end of the corridor was unlocked. She hit it with her shoulder and came through it into the intake room low and fast, and immediately moved sideways away from the entry point, because the entry point was where people aimed. The room was larger than the blueprints had suggested. A renovation probably, the same one that had relocated the secondary intake at Millward, with the primary ventilation housing occupying the far wall, a massive gray metal structure with ducting that ran up and laterally into the building's central system. The operational lighting was amber, supplemented by two handheld units that had been set on the floor to illuminate the base of the housing. 3 people. She'd trusted Reyes's count. 2 were at the housing. One of them was holding a cylindrical device approximately 60 centimeters long that she identified without needing additional information. The pressure vessel, matte gray, industrial grade, and the other was working the valve interface on the housing itself, a manual coupling that had been retrofit onto the intake panel, something that wasn't on any blueprint because it had been installed from the inside by someone with maintenance access. The inside contact. The third person in the room was Reyes. He was on one knee near the door housing with his hand pressed to his left side, and from the way he was positioned, she could see that the situation had preceded her arrival by enough time for something to have gone wrong. His weapon was on the floor 3 feet from his hand, and the man at the housing was watching him with the flat attention of someone managing a complication. Nobody had heard her come in, or they'd heard her, and made the calculation that she was not the immediate problem. She looked at the room. She looked at the valve interface. She looked at the pressure vessel. The coupling on the housing intake was a standard quarter-turn valve, retrofit, the kind used in industrial ventilation modification. The inside contact had installed it to accept the vessel's output nozzle directly into the duct stream. Once the nozzle was seated and the quarter-turn completed, the pressure vessel would discharge into the active air current and the distribution cycle would begin. The vessel was not yet seated. The man holding it was reaching for the coupling. She was closer to the manual bypass than he was. The bypass panel was on the east wall of the intake room. She'd known this from the blueprints and confirmed it the moment she entered. A gray metal access plate, hinged, with a mechanical handle behind it. The handle controlled a damper in the primary duct that would close the airflow completely. Closing that damper would kill the distribution current. The vessel could still discharge, but it would discharge into a closed system with nowhere to go, and the intake room's own ventilation was separate from the main system, slow but separate, which meant the concentration in this room would build but wouldn't propagate. It was not a perfect solution. She moved toward the panel anyway. The man with the vessel saw her first. She was faster than he'd expected someone to be from a standing start across a room, and his response was delayed by the half-second of recalibration, which was enough. She hit the panel cover, got it open, grabbed the handle. Stop. She stopped. Not because the word frightened her, because the voice attached to it was positioned in a way that told her something about where the weapon was, and the weapon was closer to Reyes than to her, and the calculation was simple. She kept her hand on the handle and turned her head. The man who had spoken was the one who'd been working the valve interface. He was standing back from it now, and he had a sidearm leveled in the controlled grip of someone comfortable with it, and the barrel was angled toward Reyes's position on the floor. "Step back," he said. She didn't step back. She didn't step forward either. She stood with her hand on the bypass handle and looked at him, and in the pause that followed, she did the thing she'd learned to do a long time ago in rooms like this one, which was to be extremely quiet internally and extremely observant externally, and to wait for the thing the other person was going to do before they did it. "You close that damper," the man said, "and I put a round through your federal agent on the floor." "He needs medical attention regardless," she said. "Closing the damper doesn't change his status. It changes mine." "Yes," she agreed, "it does." He was 40 or so, she assessed. Average build, nothing about his appearance that distinguished him from any maintenance worker in any transit system in any city, which was, she understood, the point. His name wasn't something she had, but his role was becoming clear. Not a technical operator, not the architect of whatever this was. A facilitator. Someone who knew systems and schedules and where the cameras didn't point. The man holding the vessel had finished adjusting his grip and was looking between her and the facilitator and the intake coupling, running his own calculation. "We're still on schedule," the man with the vessel said, in accented English, not Reyes's kind of English. Different. "Get it seated," the facilitator said. The man with the vessel started moving toward the coupling again. Nora pulled the handle. The damper closed with a mechanical thunk that resonated through the ducting above them, a heavy structural sound, and the ambient vibration of the ventilation system shifted immediately. The pressure differential she'd been feeling through her feet since entering the maintenance level changed, equalized, went neutral. The facilitator fired. The shot went where Reyes had been. Reyes wasn't there. He'd moved. She hadn't seen it, hadn't expected it, but he'd moved in the window created by the sound of the damper, and the round hit the floor where his knee had been, and the concrete kicked up, and Reyes came up with his weapon from where he'd retrieved it in the moment of misdirection, and his first shot took the facilitator in the shoulder, and his second shot went wide, and the facilitator went down, but didn't stay down. The man with the vessel had reached the coupling. He seated the nozzle. He reached for the quarter-turn valve handle. "Don't," Nora said. He turned the valve. Nothing happened. He turned it back and forward again, and nothing happened because the damper was closed and the distribution current was dead, and the pressure vessel was discharging into a sealed system that went nowhere, and the concentration in the room was climbing but slowly, in the way of a room with separate ventilation, and the volume of agent in the vessel versus the volume of air in the intake room produced a concentration that was dangerous but not immediately lethal at current exposure, not for the first several minutes. She was already at the bypass panel again. The damper handle had a secondary lock. She'd seen it in the blueprint annotation, a secondary mechanical lock that prevented accidental opening, installed as a safety measure. And she engaged it now, a 90-degree rotation of a secondary lever that seated a physical pin through the damper housing. Locked. Damper closed. Current dead. The man with the vessel stood in the middle of the room and looked at the coupling, and looked at the vessel and looked at Nora, and his expression went through several things. The sound from the passage door behind her, the one she'd come through, was a controlled entry, 2 people at minimum, and she stepped sideways without turning because she knew from the footfall pattern that it was Taft, and that whoever had been shooting at them in the corridor had either been neutralized or displaced. "Clear," Taft said from the door. "The room has agent contamination," she said immediately. "Partial discharge. The primary current is closed, but we have ambient concentration from the vessel. Get your respirators on before you come in." A pause. Then the sound of equipment from the doorway. She was already moving to Reyes. He was up on one knee, which was better than flat, but the hand pressed to his left side was not a posture of minor injury. She crouched beside him and moved the hand and looked. "Through and through," he said, and she couldn't tell if he was telling her or telling himself. "Stop talking," she said. The entry wound was high left lateral, below the armpit, which was survivable if nothing critical had been transected, but which bled considerably, and which she had about 3 minutes of productive assessment time on before the ambient concentration in the room reached a level that would start affecting them both without respiratory protection. "I need a kit," she said loudly, not looking up. "Right now, whatever your team carries, and I need someone on that vessel. Don't touch the nozzle end, grip the body only, move it to the east wall and lay it flat." Taft came through the door with a respirator on and a kit in his hand, and she took the kit and opened it in 4 seconds flat and had a chest seal on Reyes's exit wound before he'd finished his next breath. "The other 2, she said. "Facilitators in custody. Ortega has the second one. There's a third in the passage, possibly. Passive. He's passive." She processed that in the clinical shorthand it was delivered in and turned back to Reyes. Packed the entry wound with what the kit had, not ideal, field grade but functional, and taped his chest seal with the kind of speed that came from having done it before in conditions that made this room look comfortable. "You're going to be okay," she said. "That's a medical opinion or a—" "Medical opinion," she said. "Stop talking." He stopped talking. No. The decontamination team arrived at 5:08 a.m., 12 minutes after Taft's call went out, faster than Nora had expected, which meant they'd been staged closer than the hospital, which meant Marsh had planned for a scenario worse than the one they'd gotten. She stood in the corridor outside the intake room with a disposable respirator over her face and Reyes's blood on her jacket, and she watched the decon team work and she thought about nothing specific for approximately 4 minutes, which was unusual for her but which her body seemed to require. Marsh arrived at 5:14. He came down the maintenance corridor from the platform access, which meant his team had cleared the transit authority's own system, and he came with two more people she didn't recognize and a look on his face that she read as controlled relief. The expression of a man who had prepared for a worse outcome and received a better one and was now integrating the difference. He looked at her jacket. "Not mine," she said. "Reyes? He'll need surgery. He's stable for transport." The round went through the lateral intercostal space. "No pneumothorax on my assessment, but he needs imaging before anyone declares him clear." Marsh nodded. He looked at the intake room door where the decon team was working. He looked at the damper bypass handle visible through the door, locked in the closed position. "You closed it," he said. "Someone had to." "The secondary team at Millward took 2 individuals in custody at 4:52, he said. "The inside contact at the Transit Authority is in federal custody as of about 8 minutes ago. His name is Garrett Moore, 20-year transit employee, maintenance scheduling supervisor." He paused. "He altered work orders going back 6 weeks, set up the access, installed the coupling on the intake housing." "Who flipped him?" "That's a longer conversation. The short version is money, and then leverage, and then the point where the money and the leverage had made enough decisions for him that he didn't see a way back." Marsh looked at the floor. "He has a daughter, 7 years old. They use that." Nora didn't say anything for a moment. "Where is she?" "Safe. She was never actually in any danger. It was a fabricated threat, but he didn't know that." Marsh looked up. "He's cooperating, fully. Started talking before they got him to the vehicle." The corridor was quiet except for the decon team and the distant sound of the transit system's overnight systems running their cycles, unaware of what had almost moved through them. "The cell," Nora said. "How far does it go?" "We're still mapping. The 3 in this facility, the 2 at Millward more. There are upstream connections we're working." He looked at her. "It'll take weeks to fully unravel." "But the attack is stopped." "The attack is stopped." He said it cleanly, without embellishment, the way you state a fact that's cost something to establish. She nodded. Her legs were tired. She noticed that specifically. The adrenaline margin was closing, and what was underneath it was the accumulated weight of a night that had started with a man convulsing on the ambulance dock at 2:31 a.m. and had moved through about 14 decisions she hadn't planned to make, and one that she'd been carrying for 4 years without knowing she'd still need it. "I need to get back to the hospital," she said. Marsh looked at her with an expression she remembered from the last time she'd stood in front of him under circumstances that mattered. Not sentiment, he wasn't a sentimental man, but something that acknowledged the specific weight of what had passed between them. A recognition. "There'll be a debrief," he said. "I know. And a review. Of your status, of the file." "I know that too." "It won't be simple." She almost laughed. Not quite. "None of this was simple, Colonel." He held her eyes for a moment longer, and then he turned to manage the operational pieces that needed managing, because that was what he did, and because there were still pieces that needed managing. Nora walked back through the maintenance corridor toward the utility passage and the long route back to a city that was 2 hours from waking up. Harlow Memorial at 6:30 a.m. was a different organism than the place she'd left. The federal restriction had been partially lifted. Essential staff back on floor, non-essential personnel still held in a waiting pattern, and the emergency department was running on a skeleton configuration, 2 nurses and the overnight resident managing what had come in during the lockdown. The decontamination team had cleared the ambulance bay and the trauma bay and issued a conditional all-clear with follow-up monitoring requirements that Deborah was already documenting, with the thoroughness of someone who understood that documentation was the difference between institutional protection and institutional liability. Nora came in through the main entrance. Not the staff entrance, not the ambulance bay. The main entrance, the one with the automatic doors and the information desk and the lobby chairs, like any other person walking into a hospital at 6:30 in the morning. The overnight security at the desk, not Gus, a different guard, started to stand up, the automatic response to someone in dirty clothes with what was clearly blood on their jacket. She showed him her badge, not Deborah's visitor card, her own badge, which she'd never technically surrendered because no one had actually collected it during the chaos of the lockdown. He sat back down. She took the elevator to 4. The floor was quiet in the particular way of a space that has been through something and hasn't yet decided how to process it. The nursing station had papers scattered across it that hadn't been there before. The doors to the family consultation room were open, and the folding table was still there, the tactical blueprints gone but the chairs still pushed to the walls. She went to the trauma bay. The patient was awake, not alert, sedated to a controlled level, intubated, connected to 3 different monitors. But his eyes were open and tracking, and when she came to his bedside, they tracked to her and stayed. "Hi," she said. His eyes moved. Not much else. "You said transit ventilation," she said. "That was enough. You did your part." Something in his face shifted slightly. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated than relief. She checked his chart. The overnight resident had made good decisions. Conservative, appropriate, the kind of medicine you practiced when you understood the limits of your own knowledge. She noted one adjustment, wrote it in the chart, checked his lines. She was replacing the monitoring lead that had partially detached when she heard the footsteps behind her. She didn't turn around immediately. She finished what she was doing. "I was told you'd be here." Fenn's voice, tighter than usual, the particular compression of a man who has been managing something uncomfortable for several hours. She turned. He was standing in the bay doorway. He wasn't in scrubs anymore. He'd changed at some point, business casual, as if the administrative dimension of the night had required a different costume than the clinical one. He looked tired. He also looked like someone who'd had a conversation or several that had changed the shape of the room he was standing in. "The patient needs the adjustment I've noted in the chart," she said. "His potassium is drifting. It's been drifting since about 3 a.m. and nobody caught it." Ben looked at the chart, at the patient, back at her. "There are people from the Federal Task Office downstairs," he said. "They've been here since 5:30. They want to speak with the administrator. All right? They've also submitted a formal commendation request for you." He said it as if the words had an unusual texture. "For actions during what they're describing as a domestic security incident." She waited. "The hospital's legal office has been on the phone since 6 a.m., he continued, "about liability exposure, about the patient's treatment, about the protocols involved." He was looking at the chart, not at her. "Their preliminary assessment is that the treatment you administered was..." A pause that had something in it she couldn't fully identify. "Not only correct, but likely the only option that would have stabilized the patient in the available window." "Yes," she said simply. "I may have been..." He stopped, tried again. "The situation was not what I understood it to be." It was not an apology. She didn't expect one. What it was a man who had built a professional identity on never being wrong, trying to navigate the specific geography of having been wrong in a way that had implications he was still mapping. "No," she said. "It wasn't." She looked at him directly, and he looked back at her, and between them was 4 years of mornings like this one. Or not like this one, but built from the same materials. 4 years of being spoken past and overridden and managed and dismissed. And she didn't feel the particular satisfaction she might have expected from this moment, because satisfaction required energy, and she was running low. What she felt was tired and clear and done. "The patient needs the potassium adjustment within the next 30 minutes, she said. "I've left the dosage in the chart." She walked past him toward the bay door. "Callaway." She paused without turning. "I'll make sure it's done," he said. She went through the door. Min. Voss found her in the staff break room at 7:02 a.m., sitting at the small table with a cup of coffee she'd made from the machine in the corner and hadn't drunk, just held, because the warmth was useful even if the coffee wasn't. Voss sat down across from her without being invited, which Nora didn't mind. "Reyes is in surgery," Voss said. "They're calling it clean, hour and a half probably." "Good." "The cell?" "The 2 primary operators from the intake room, the 2 from Millward, and the 2 field contacts we picked up outside the depot. 6 in custody. More makes 7. She folded her hands on the table. "The upstream connections are going to take time, but the active network in this region is closed." "And the agent?" "Neutralized on site. The decon team handled full disposal. The vessel is in federal custody." Voss looked at the table. "The transit authority will reopen on schedule. Passengers will get on the 7:15 and the 7:45 and none of them will know. That's the point, Nora said. Yes. Voss was quiet for a moment. Colonel Marsh wants to meet with you formally at 1400, at the Federal Field Office on Brennan Street. I know where it is. I assumed you might. Voss looked at her. The review of your file is going to result in a reinstatement offer. He hasn't officially said that, but I'm telling you because I know how these things go, and I think you should have time to think about what you want to say before you're in the room with him. Nora turned her coffee cup in her hands. What would you say? She asked. In my position? Voss thought about it. I don't know. I've never been in your position. She paused. I've been in rooms where people were offered things they'd already given up, and I've watched them try to decide if the giving up was permanent or provisional, and I've never been able to predict which way it goes. She looked at Nora steadily. What I do know is that tonight mattered. What you did tonight mattered. And people who do things that matter usually have more of those things in them, if the circumstances let them. Nora looked at the untouched coffee. She thought about Reyes counting down on his fingers in the amber-lit corridor. She thought about Taft's footfalls in the passage. She thought about the damper handle in her hand and the mechanical thunk of it closing and the silence that followed when the distribution current died. She thought about a man on the ambulance dock, convulsing, gray-faced, someone who had known something important and had been held at the edge of death while someone else decided, and who had spent whatever was left in him to say 2 words to a nurse who happened to be standing close enough to hear them. She thought about Dr. Marcus Fenn saying, I'll make sure it's done in the voice of a man recalibrating the map of the room he thought he'd been standing in for years. She thought about 4 years of invisible mornings. Tell Marsh I'll be there at 1400, she said. Voss nodded and stood up. At the door she paused, and Nora thought she was going to say something operational, something procedural, a logistics item that needed closing. Instead, Voss said, For what it's worth, you were the most competent person in the building tonight. Then she was gone. Nora sat with the coffee that had gone cold. Outside the break room window, Denton was waking up, the sky lightening from the particular blue-black of pre-dawn to something grayer, warmer, the first suggestion of a morning that was going to arrive on schedule, unhurried, unremarkable, carrying along with it the thousands of people who would board the 7:15 without knowing what hadn't happened. She was still sitting there at 7:18 when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered it on the second ring. This is Callaway. Static. Then a voice she didn't recognize, rough, careful, someone speaking through a connection that wasn't clean, with background noise that resolved, after a second of listening, into what sounded like traffic. The operative you stabilized, the voice said. He's not our only person in Denton. She went very still. The cell you dismantled tonight, the voice continued, is not the only cell. The morning light was coming through the window now, and the coffee was cold in her hands, and somewhere in the building below her, Deborah was updating the charge log, and Fenn was ordering the potassium adjustment she'd noted, and the day shift was beginning its handoff, and outside the transit system was running at 7:15 on time, and the platforms were filling with people who didn't know. Who is this? She said. Someone who needs what you did tonight to happen again, the voice said. Somewhere else. Very soon. The line went dead. She sat with the deadline for 3 seconds before she moved. Not 3 seconds of hesitation. 3 seconds of the specific mental process she'd learned to run under pressure, the kind that took everything available and sorted it into what was actionable and what wasn't, because panic was a luxury and she'd never been able to afford it. The voice, the connection quality, the background traffic noise, which had a particular pitch, elevated, highway rather than city street, moving at speed. Someone calling from a vehicle, someone who knew she was in this building, at this hour, on a number she hadn't given anyone, someone who had access to the operative's information. She set her cold coffee down and walked out of the break room. Voss was still in the building. She'd gone toward the elevator, not the exit, which meant she was still on one of the upper floors. Nora took the stairs. Faster, and she needed a moment without the enclosed space of an elevator while she was still assembling the shape of what had just happened. She found Voss in the family consultation room on 3, on the phone, standing at the window. Voss looked up when she entered and read something in Nora's face that made her cut the call short. What? Voss said. Nora told her. She kept it precise. The exact words, the voice characteristics, the background audio, the line going dead. Voss listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd noticed about Voss from the beginning. She listened the way careful people listened, not waiting for a gap to speak into, but actually processing. When Nora finished, Voss said, "Your number. Personal cell. Not on file anywhere connected to this operation." Which means they accessed it through the operative, Voss said, or through someone who has the operative's network contacts. She was already pulling her own phone out. Or it's a test. A test of what? Whether you'd report it. Voss was dialing. Some operations run contact verification through the people they want to recruit. See if they go to the authorities immediately or sit on it. She put the phone to her ear. The fact that you walked out of that break room and found me inside of 4 minutes tells me something. It tells you I'm not compromised. It tells me you make fast decisions and you don't second-guess them. She spoke briefly into the phone. Names, a trace request on the number, prioritized, and hung up. It also confirms what I already thought, which is that whatever happened tonight, there are people on the other side of it who know who you are. Nora stood at the edge of the table. The chairs were still against the walls. How many people had my personal number before tonight? We can find out. It'll take a few hours. Voss looked at her steadily. You should tell Marsh. Before 1400. I'm going to call him now. She did, from the hallway outside the consultation room, standing at the same window where she'd watched the helicopters come in 6 hours ago. The sky was full daylight now, pale and overcast, the kind of Pacific Northwest morning that couldn't quite commit to anything. She told Marsh what she'd told Voss. He was quiet for a longer time than Voss had been, which meant he was running a more complicated calculation. Come in at 10, he said finally. Not 1400, 10. All right. And Nora. A pause she recognized. The voice. You said careful. What kind of careful? She thought about it. Operational. Not nervous. Not performing calm. Actually calm, the way someone is when they've said something like that before and know what comes next. She looked at the parking lot below, where the dark SUVs had been, now empty asphalt. Someone who's done this work. Another pause. 10 o'clock, he said, and ended the call. She stood at the window for one more minute. The morning was filling in around her. She could hear the day shift moving on the floor, the handoff conversations, the particular ambient noise of a hospital returning to its operational baseline after a disruption. Somewhere below her, the gift shop was probably opening. The cafeteria was definitely opening. The world was running its routines with the comfortable indifference of something that didn't know how close the morning had come to being a different kind of morning entirely. She went back to 4. Young. The disciplinary file on Nora Callaway had been opened at 4:15 a.m. by a hospital administrator who had been woken by a call from Dr. Marcus Fenn and had documented the complaint: insubordination, unauthorized medication administration, refusal of a direct order from an attending physician, before going back to sleep because administrators processed paperwork at any hour, but crises waited until business hours. By 8:30 a.m., 2 things had happened to that file. The first was that the hospital's legal office had attached a federal incident report to the associated patient record, which had the effect of flagging the file for secondary review before any action could be taken. The second was that Voss had walked into the administrator's office at 8:22 a.m. and had a conversation that lasted 11 minutes, and which the administrator would later describe to anyone who asked as one of the most clarifying conversations of his professional life. Nora wasn't present for it. She found out about it afterward from Deborah, who had been in the hallway outside the administrator's office for unrelated reasons and had heard enough through the door to construct a reasonable summary. What Deborah reported was this: Voss had presented the federal documentation of the night's events, had outlined the specific clinical decisions Nora had made and their outcomes, had noted that those decisions had been made under time pressure and against institutional resistance, and had produced the only result that was medically viable. She had then, apparently, made a brief observation about what would happen to Harlow Memorial's position in any subsequent legal proceeding if the hospital moved forward with a disciplinary action against the person whose intervention had prevented a mass casualty event. The administrator had not argued. The file was closed at 8:47 a.m. Nobody called Nora to tell her. She found out when she walked past the administrator's office at 9:10, and he came to his door and said, with the careful phrasing of someone who'd been thinking about how to phrase it, that the hospital wanted to express its support for her continued role in the department, and that the events of the previous night reflected well on her professional judgment. She said, "Thank you." She meant it in the stripped-down sense, not the warm sense. He had done something that needed doing, and she acknowledged it the way you acknowledge a thing that needed doing. He seemed to have expected something more, and when it didn't come, he nodded once and went back into his office. She kept walking. What happened to Marcus Fenn didn't happen in a single moment. It happened the way most significant things happened, gradually and then unmistakably. The first piece was procedural. The hospital's peer review committee, which met quarterly and which had, for the past 3 years, reviewed Fenn's performance with the collegial accommodation extended to senior attendings who generated good numbers and didn't create visible problems, received a request at 9 a.m. from the legal office to conduct an expedited review of the overnight incident. The legal office framed it as liability protection, which it was, but the effect was that 6 people who had professional authority over Fenn were now reading a documented account of his decisions between 2:31 and 3:05 a.m. The account was not flattering. It included the timeline of his arrival, his dismissal of Nora's initial assessment, his instruction to remove her from the bay, the documented heart rate of the patient during that window, 42 beats per minute, 38 beats per minute, declining, and the subsequent stabilization following her unauthorized intervention. It included Holloway's witness documentation, which Holloway had filed at 7:30 a.m. with the kind of quiet precision of a resident who had watched something and decided that watching it without documenting it was not something he wanted to have done. Holloway had not been asked to file it. He'd filed it because he was 28 years old and had gone into medicine for reasons he hadn't yet had occasion to compromise. And the night had clarified something for him about the relationship between institutional deference and patient outcomes that he expected to carry forward. The second piece was the federal commendation request, which arrived at the hospital formally at 10:15 a.m., and which named Nora Callaway specifically and described her role in the night's events in terms that the peer review committee could not read in conjunction with the incident account without reaching a conclusion about the gap between the two. The third piece was Fenn himself. He'd come in at 8 a.m. and managed his morning with the surface competence of someone who had decided to act as if the previous night was a containable problem. He'd been in the ER at 8:30, attending rounds at 9, and he'd functioned effectively during both because the clinical part of Marcus Fenn was genuinely capable, and the clinical part didn't require the same conditions as the rest of him. But the peer review request landed on his phone at 9:45, and the notification that it was expedited rather than quarterly landed beside it, and the combination produced a change in his movement through the floor that Nora observed from the nursing station without comment. He was shorter with the residents. He was more deliberate in his documentation. He was, she thought, beginning to understand the shape of what was coming. She didn't take satisfaction from that. She'd thought about it, had tried to locate the satisfaction she might have expected to feel, and what she found instead was something more neutral and less energizing than satisfaction. Something like, this is the appropriate outcome, and the appropriate outcome is happening, not triumph, more like accuracy. She was finishing her chart notes from the overnight when Deborah appeared beside her. "The peer committee has requested your documentation," Deborah said quietly. "Everything from last night. Your assessments, your medication log, your timeline of the patient's presentation. I'll have it ready in 20 minutes. Also," Deborah paused, "Holloway asked me to tell you that he filed a witness statement. He wanted you to know it was his decision." Nora looked up. "Tell him I said thank you." He also said, another pause, that he learned something last night. He didn't say what. He thought you'd understand. She looked back at the chart. "I do." The documentation took 18 minutes. She was thorough in the way she was thorough with everything. Not exhaustive, just complete. Every relevant detail in its correct position. Times accurate to the minute, clinical reasoning explicit and sourced. She had kept notes on her personal phone, a habit from training that she'd never dropped, and those notes served as the backbone of the account. She submitted it at 9:58 a.m. and left for the federal field office on Brennan Street at 9:59. The field office was a building she'd been in before, under circumstances that felt walking through its lobby now in her dirty jacket, with blood she hadn't had time to change out of, both very close and very far away. The lobby was different. The security desk configuration had changed, but the elevator banks were the same, and the floor she was directed to was different from the one she remembered. And Marsh was waiting in a conference room that had a long window and a view of the street below, and a pot of coffee on the side table that was fresh, which she appreciated. She sat across from him. There were two other people in the room. A woman she didn't know, 40s, government-issue professional composure, and a man who introduced himself as Carver from a directorate she recognized by its structural position in the chain of command, even though he didn't name it specifically. The call had been traced. Marsh told her this before anything else, leading with it because he understood that it was the information most relevant to her personal situation. The number had been a burner, activated the previous evening, used once, disposed of. The call had originated from a cell tower on Interstate 90, eastbound, consistent with the highway traffic she'd heard in the background. The phone itself had been found 6 hours later on the roadside near the Snoqualmie Pass exit, wiped, physically damaged, not recoverable. Whoever made that call, Marsh said, knew you'd try to trace it and knew the trace would find exactly what they left for it to find, which tells us the operational sophistication of the person we're dealing with. It also tells us they wanted us to know the call was real, she said. They left enough for us to confirm the basics. That's not someone trying to disappear. That's someone communicating. Carver leaned forward. That's our read too. She looked at him. He had the careful energy of someone with a specific agenda who hadn't stated it yet. She'd met enough people like that to know that the agenda usually appeared within the first 10 minutes of a meeting because people with specific agendas found silence uncomfortable. The cell network in Denton was one branch of a larger structure, Carver said. We've known about the structure for 7 months. We've been mapping it. What happened last night accelerated our timeline significantly. The arrests, the intelligence from Moore, the secondary intercepts from the Millward operation. We're not starting from the beginning anymore. But you're not done, she said. We're not done, he agreed. There are 2 additional nodes we've identified. One is in a city I can't name in this room yet. One is here, in Denton, embedded differently than the transit network was, smaller, more compartmentalized, and connected to an infrastructure target we haven't fully characterized. Marsh was watching her, not with the expression of someone waiting for her reaction, with the expression of someone who had already processed his own reaction and was now observing hers. The person who called me, she said, you think they're connected to the node here? We think they're the node here, Carver said, or close to it, and we think the call was an approach. An approach to what? To you, Marsh said. Specifically, the person who called knows what you did last night. They're interested in your capabilities. And we think, he paused, choosing the next words with the care of someone who understood their weight. We think they may be operating on the assumption that because your file is sealed and your cover here is established, you might be recruitable, she said. Yes. The conference room was quiet except for the ambient noise of the building and the street sound filtering through the window. She looked at the table, at the surface of it, at the reflection of the overhead lights. You want to use the approach, she said. You want me to respond to it? Carver said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She looked at Marsh. Say it. We want you to come back, he said. Not as what you were before. The operational context is different. Your cover in Denton is genuine. 4 years of documented employment, established relationships, a record at Harlow that now includes a formal federal commendation. That's not a manufactured legend. That's a life. And it's the best position anyone in our structure currently has relative to the remaining network activity in this city. He folded his hands on the table. We're asking you to use it. She breathed. Outside the window, Denton was doing what it did on a Wednesday morning. People moving along the street below, a delivery truck double parked, a cyclist arguing the sidewalk versus the lane in the way cyclists did. Ordinary. Continuous. The exact kind of ordinary that had been 4 hours from becoming something catastrophic when the morning started. The nurse who saved Reyes's life in that intake room, she said slowly, not to either of them, just to the room, working it out. The nurse who stabilized the operative and administered the correct antidote and closed the bypass damper. That person is on record, federally commended, known. Yes, Marsh said. If I respond to the approach, I'm doing it as that person, not as a ghost, not as a sealed file. She looked at him. The approach came to Nora Callaway's number. They think they're approaching a nurse who happened to know too much. That's our read, which means my value to this operation depends on them continuing to think that. Yes, Marsh said again, and if they look deeper at any point, then the cover is the truth, Carver said. That's its strength. There's no fabrication to unravel. Everything about Nora Callaway is real. The hospital employment is real. The apartment is real. The 4 years are real. The only thing that isn't on the surface is what's underneath it, and what's underneath it is classified at a level that requires more resources to access than a regional network cell has available. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the break room, the cold coffee, the window with the morning coming through it, the phone buzzing in her hand. She thought about what Voss had said. People who do things that matter usually have more of those things in them. She thought about 4 years of invisible mornings and a man convulsing on an ambulance dock and the handle of the bypass damper cold in her palm and the mechanical thunk of it closing and the silence that came after, which had been, briefly, impermanently, in the specific way of silences that cost something. Enough. I want 2 things, she said. Marsh waited. Full reinstatement of my record. Not sealed, not active, just accurate. Whatever happened in those 6 years, I want it in my file as what it was. I'm done with the blank space. Done, he said, without hesitation. And I stay at Harlow. He looked at her. You want to keep the nursing position? The nursing position is the cover, she said. But it's also... She paused and said the honest thing, which was the only kind of thing she'd ever been good at saying. It's also the part that works. Last night, I stabilized a man who would have died without me, and I closed a valve that prevented a mass exposure event, and both of those things use the same set of skills. I'm not choosing between them. I'm telling you they're not in conflict. Marsh looked at her for a long time. Not evaluating. She'd already passed whatever evaluation this meeting was conducting, but doing something that looked like what it actually was, which was a man who had sent a great many people into difficult circumstances, seeing one of them across a table in the ordinary light of a Wednesday morning and deciding something about what he owed her. Both, he said. You have both. She nodded. There's one more thing, Carver said. He slid a folder across the table. She opened it. Inside was a single page, a physical page, printed, no digital copy, with a photograph and a name and a brief summary of activity. She looked at the photograph for a moment. The man in it was mid-50s, unremarkable, the kind of face you forgot immediately in a crowd, which was clearly deliberate. The summary indicated 14 months of domestic activity, 3 connected operations, and 1 identifying thread, a background in industrial ventilation systems. Commercial, municipal, the kind of background that gave a person intimate knowledge of how buildings breathed, how transit systems breathed. This is who sent the operatives, she said. It wasn't a question. We believe so. He goes by a designation, not a name. We don't have confirmation of his real identity yet. Carver's voice was careful. We think the call to your phone this morning may have come from someone acting on his direction, someone inside Denton who serves as his regional coordinator. She closed the folder. Then we find the coordinator, she said, and through the coordinator we find him. The peer review committee at Harlow Memorial issued its preliminary findings at 2 p.m. that same day. Nora was not present for the meeting. She was at the federal field office until noon, and then she went home and slept for 3 hours in the particular heavy way of someone whose body has finally collected the debt the night had run up, and she woke to her phone showing a message from Deborah that said, "Call me when you're up, something you should know." She called. Deborah's voice had a particular quality that Nora had learned to read over 4 years. The charge nurse didn't editorialize in words, but she editorialized in tone, and the tone now was somewhere between professional satisfaction and the careful restraint of someone who understood that the appropriate response to institutional accountability was not celebration, but acknowledgement. The committee found significant departures from accepted practice in Dr. Finn's management of the overnight incident, Deborah said. Specifically, the dismissal of a clinical assessment that was subsequently proven correct, the failure to implement appropriate barrier protocol when presented with an unknown exposure risk, and the attempt to remove a treating nurse from an active resuscitation without documented clinical justification. What are the consequences? Nora asked. He's been placed on administrative supervision pending a full review. That means all his clinical decisions require co-sign from the department chief for the next 60 days. A pause. He's also been removed from the ER department leadership rotation, effective immediately. The leadership rotation. He was supposed to rotate in as acting chief next month. That's been suspended indefinitely. Deborah's tone shifted fractionally. He's still on staff. He's still practicing, but the committee's findings are part of his permanent record, and the documentation from last night is, she searched for the word, substantial. Nora sat on the edge of her bed in her quiet apartment with the afternoon light coming through the curtains she'd picked because they blocked most of the morning sun and let in the afternoon, a small practical choice she'd made years ago that had nothing to do with anything except that she slept days sometimes. How did he take it? She asked. I wasn't in the room, Deborah said. I heard from Holloway, who was. He said Fenn didn't argue. He just, another search for the right word, received it. That told her something about Marcus Fenn she hadn't known before, and it was more complicated than she'd expected. A man who could be silent in that moment was a man who understood, somewhere, what had happened and what it meant, even if the understanding came too late to be useful to anyone who'd needed it sooner. It didn't change the 4 years. It didn't change the patient on the gurney with a heart rate of 38. But it was something. Thank you, she told Deborah. Come back soon, Deborah said. We're short. She almost laughed. Tomorrow night. Good. She set her phone down and sat with the quiet of her apartment for a moment. The specific quiet of a place that was hers, that contained her things, that she'd furnished practically and without sentiment, and that had served her well for 4 years as the place she came back to, the room where she was just Nora and not any other thing. She thought about what it meant to come back tomorrow night, to pull on scrubs and white sneakers and walk through the ER doors and do the things she did, the careful and necessary work of keeping people alive in the hours they most needed someone to be paying attention. She'd done it for 4 years as a form of being somewhere without being seen, and she was going to do it now as something else, as the person she'd shown herself to be last night, in the full view of everyone who'd been in those rooms. That was different. She didn't know yet exactly how it would feel to do the same work under a different kind of visibility. She suspected it would be imperfect, which was fine, because she was imperfect, and the work was imperfect, and the nights were long and full of things that didn't resolve cleanly, and people who surprised you, and systems that failed, and moments where all you had was what you knew and what you were willing to do with it. She went to her kitchen, made actual food for the first time in 18 hours, eggs, toast, nothing interesting, and ate it standing at the counter because she didn't feel like sitting. At 4:30 p.m., she went back to the hospital. Not for a shift. Not for a call. She went because there was something she'd left unfinished, and she'd never been comfortable leaving things unfinished. The operative, the man from the ambulance dock, the man with the tattoo and the 2 words, had been moved to the ICU in the early afternoon, which was appropriate and indicated the kind of progress she'd hoped for when she'd adjusted his IV line at dawn. She checked with the ICU charge nurse, who confirmed he was awake, stable, and had been cleared for brief non-medical contact by the federal team. She went in. He was sitting up slightly, which was more than she'd expected. The intubation tube was out. They'd extubated him around noon, apparently, another good sign. And he had the specific look of someone who was inhabiting the aftermath of something large and hadn't yet decided how to feel about being on the inhabiting side of it. He looked at her when she came in. She pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down, because standing over someone in a hospital bed was its own kind of power dynamic, and she'd never liked it. I'm Nora, she said. His voice, when it came, was rough from the tube but functional. I know who you are. A pause. They told me. How are you feeling? Like someone poisoned me. He looked at the ceiling. Which is accurate. It is. She looked at his arm where the IV tape was clean and new. The tattoo. Under there. He didn't respond immediately. I recognized the unit, she said. A long time ago. He looked at her. There was something in his eyes that was both careful and exhausted in the way of someone who has been carrying operational security through an experience that should, by rights, have made carrying anything impossible. You were, he started. A long time ago, she said again. It doesn't matter right now. What matters is that you're here. I wasn't sure I'd be. He looked at the window. I wasn't sure they'd take me somewhere in time. They almost didn't. She said it plainly, because he was someone who deserved plain information about his own survival. You had about 12 minutes when you arrived. He absorbed that. The people who dropped me, they made a decision. Someone did, she agreed. I don't know who. I do, he said. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press, because that was information that belonged to a debrief she wasn't part of. They picked the right place, he said instead. She looked at him. They picked the right place, he said again. And it was clear he meant not just the hospital, but the specific nurse who'd been at the end of the corridor when the security call came in. Someone new. She thought about that for a moment. Someone who knew where she worked. Someone who knew what she was. Someone who'd made a decision in a dark window somewhere with a man dying in the back of a car. She filed it. Rest, she said, and stood up. You've got a long week of being evaluated ahead of you. Save your energy for the debrief. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. Advice from a nurse. Among other things, she said. She was at the door when he said, Callaway. She paused. Thank you, he said. Not operational, not formal, just two words with the full weight of what they meant sitting inside them, uncomplicated by anything else. She thought about the ambulance dock at 2:31 a.m., the gray face and the pinpoint pupils, and the 2 seconds she'd given herself to decide. She thought about the bypass handle and Reyes counting down on his fingers, and Taft's body dropping beside her on the corridor floor, and the cold coffee, and the phone buzzing with a number she didn't know. She thought about what all of it added up to, and whether it had a shape, and whether that shape meant anything beyond the immediate arithmetic of who lived and who didn't. She thought it did. She thought the shape was something like this, that the things you know and the things you've been and the choices you made in the years before this one don't disappear when you decide to be something quieter. They go somewhere. They wait. And when the moment arrives that specifically requires them, not a general readiness, not abstract capability, but the exact and particular knowledge that fits the exact and particular emergency, they're there. 4 years of invisible mornings, 4 years of swallowed assessments and overridden protocols, and a man who looked through her like furniture. And then one night, when all of it collapsed into a single corridor and a single handle and the complete unambiguous knowledge of exactly what to do, she didn't say any of that to him. Get some sleep, she said. You've earned it. She went back out into the hallway, where the ICU ran its steady rhythms and the late afternoon light came through the west-facing windows at the low angle of a day winding down. And she walked toward the elevator with the particular posture of someone who is going somewhere specific and knows exactly why. Well, the formal reinstatement of her record happened on a Thursday, 11 days later, in an office at the Federal Field Office on Brennan Street with Marsh and a notary and 2 documents that required her signature. It took 20 minutes. There was no ceremony. She hadn't expected one and wouldn't have wanted it. What her file said now was accurate. The 6 years were in it. The operations were in it, summarized in the specific compressed language that classified documentation used, which flattened significant things into institutional shorthand but at least confirmed their existence. The commendation from the current operation was attached. The 4 years at Harlow Memorial were in it as active cover, which changed their administrative classification from civilian employment to operational continuity. She was, in the file, the thing she'd actually been all along. There was something clean about that, something she hadn't expected to feel as strongly as she did. She signed where she was told to sign. She shook Marsh's hand. She went back to work. The formal disciplinary outcome for Marcus Fenn was issued on a Friday, 3 weeks after the incident, following the completion of the peer committee's full review. The findings were 19 pages, which was long for that committee, and they were entered into his permanent credentialing record with the hospital and reported to the state medical board as required by the circumstances. The board opened its own review on the following Monday. Nora didn't follow the proceedings closely. She heard about them the way she heard about most things on the floor, through Deborah, through the ambient information that circulated in any workplace, through the occasional overheard conversation at the nursing station. She didn't seek out the details, and she didn't avoid them. She noted them the way you noted a weather change. Something was different now. The room had different pressure, and you adjusted. What she noticed most was the floor itself. Holloway stopped treating her assessments as provisional. He read her notes before making decisions, the way she'd always read the chart before touching a patient, treating someone else's observation as data rather than background noise. He didn't make a production of it. He just did it, the way you do something once you've understood why it matters. The travel nurse Cressida had 4 weeks left on her contract, and she finished them with the careful neutrality of someone who had made an assessment early and was now recalibrating without wanting to appear to recalibrate. Nora bore her no ill will. People made social calculations, and Cressida's had been reasonable given the information available at the time. The information had changed. Gus, the security guard, brought her coffee one morning without explanation. He set it on the nursing station counter while she was charting and walked away without making it a conversation, which was exactly the right way to do it. She drank it. It was better than the break room machine. The operative, she never learned his working name, only the designation his unit used, which was a number she kept to herself, was discharged from the ICU to a federal medical facility on day 6, and from there to wherever people like him went to recover. She got one message through channels that shouldn't have been available for personal communication that said, "Doing well, still owe you one." She deleted it because she was supposed to and filed the sentiment somewhere appropriate. Reyes texted her from his hospital bed 8 days post-surgery. Surgery was clean. Doc says 4 weeks. Tell Taft I want my jacket back. She passed the message to Voss, who she assumed passed it to Taft. She never found out about the jacket. The second cell, the one in the unnamed city Carver had referenced, was dismantled 31 days after the Denton operation through a coordinated action involving 3 agencies and a sequence of events she was only partially briefed on. She knew because Marsh called her, which was how she understood the connection to her own operation, and she accepted the information and asked the relevant follow-up questions and went back to her shift. The Denton node was slower. It was always the harder one, smaller, more embedded, the coordinator careful in a way the transit network hadn't been. She responded to the original approach 9 days after receiving it, through a channel that Carver's team had set up and monitored, and what followed was a slow, careful series of communications that she won't describe here and that took weeks, and that required her to be simultaneously a night shift ER nurse at Harlow Memorial and something much older and more specific. She was good at being 2 things at once. She'd had practice. There was one evening, about 6 weeks after the night that started everything, that she counted as the actual end of it. Not the operational end, which had its own timeline, but the personal end, the closing of something internal she hadn't been able to fully name until it closed. She was at the nursing station at 11:45 p.m., doing chart notes, when a code came in from the ambulance bay. Cardiac, male, mid-60s, responding to field intervention, but unstable. She went to the bay the way she always went to the bay, at a pace that was fast without being panicked, because panic moved faster than information, and that was never the right order. The man they brought in was nothing like the man from 6 weeks ago. He was local, identified, a name and a history and a family that was being called as she ran the resuscitation. He was just a man who'd had a bad night, and she worked the code with Holloway and the new resident Park and the Bay team, and it was hard and it was close and it did not go perfectly. There was a moment, around the 16-minute mark, where the numbers suggested a conclusion she didn't accept. And she made 2 adjustments that weren't the obvious ones, and then a third that was, and the rhythm came back, imperfect and present and real. When the man stabilized, nobody saluted. Nobody issued a commendation. Callaway said, "Good call," in the specific, understated way he developed over 6 weeks of working nights beside her, and she said, "Start the second drip, keep the family informed," and move to the next chart. The bay doors swung shut behind her, and the corridor was the same corridor it had always been. The fluorescent lights, the linoleum, the ventilation system, the phone ringing at the nursing station, and she walked back to her charting and did not feel invisible. She felt exactly like what she was. Someone who knew things that mattered and was in a place where they mattered, and who was, for the first time in 4 years, not performing smallness as a strategy. The chart note she wrote that night was 3 paragraphs, precise and complete, with the times accurate to the minute and the clinical reasoning explicit. She signed it N. Callaway, RN. The world didn't change when she signed it. The corridor didn't change. The shift kept going, the calls kept coming, and outside the hospital, the city moved through its dark middle hours with the comfortable indifference of something that didn't know it was being watched over. But she knew. That was the thing, in the end. The thing that nobody gave out as a certificate or entered into a file or said at a commendation. The thing that the nights accumulated into, slowly, one decision at a time. You knew what you were, and when the moment asked for it, you were it, completely, without apology and without announcement. The rest was just the work, and the work was waiting.